in the grand halls of Ravencrest Palace, where golden tapestries hide listening ears and marble statues witness whispered confessions, some secrets refuse to stay buried. When Queen Consort Isabel Montclair was escorted from the palace gates in disgrace, the kingdom held its breath. But the real shock came 3 days later, when the private journals of the beloved late Queen Evangeline appeared in a London auction house, their contents threatening to destroy everything the House of Aldrich had built over centuries. Prince Alexander, heir to the Eldorian throne, stood at his office window watching his stepmother's car disappear into the morning mist. His hands trembled not with grief, but with a rage so pure it could have melted the ancient crown jewels. The woman who had slithered into his family's life after his mother's tragic death had finally shown her true nature. But as he turned to face the crisis brewing in the newspapers scattered across his mahogany desk, Alexander realized that Isabel's betrayal was just the beginning of a storm that would either destroy his family's legacy or forge it into something stronger than ever before. The auction catalog lay open to page 47, where his mother's elegant handwriting was displayed for the world to see. 3 words that would change everything. The king knows. But what did his mother discover? And how far would the royal family go to keep their darkest secrets from seeing the light of day? This is the story of 7 days that shook a kingdom, where loyalty was tested, love was questioned, and the very foundations of the crown trembled beneath the weight of truth. The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering windows of Ravencrest Palace as Queen Consort Isabel Montclair packed her final belongings into leather suitcases that had once belonged to royalty far greater than herself. Her hands moved with practiced precision, folding silk scarves and placing diamond earrings into velvet boxes. But her mind raced with calculations and contingencies. She had always known this day might come, though she had hoped her careful manipulations would have bought her more time. Prince Alexander stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the entrance to what had once been his mother's private chambers. The irony was not lost on him that Isabel had chosen to occupy the very rooms where Queen Evangeline had spent her final months, writing in the leather-bound journals that were now causing such chaos. His blue eyes, so reminiscent of his late mother's, held none of the warmth that had made Evangeline beloved by millions. Instead, they burned with a cold fury that had been building for 3 years. "I suppose you think you've won," Isabel said without turning around. Her voice carried the slight accent of her native Valdoria, a small country that had benefited greatly from her marriage into the Eldorian royal family. She continued folding a cream-colored blouse, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the security guards waiting in the corridor. "One?" Alexander stepped into the room, his footsteps muffled by the Persian carpet that had been a wedding gift to his parents 28 years ago. "This isn't a game, Isabel. This is about betrayal on a level that would make Machiavelli himself blush with shame." Isabel finally turned to face him, and Alexander was struck by how little remorse showed in her emerald eyes. Even now, with her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, she maintained the regal bearing that had first caught his father's attention at a charity gala in Monaco. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. She looked every inch the queen she had fought so hard to become. "Your mother was going to destroy everything," Isabel said, her voice gaining strength. "Do you have any idea what those journals contain? The secrets she uncovered? The lives that would have been ruined? So you decided to steal them and sell them to the highest bidder." Alexander's voice rose slightly, the only sign of the volcanic rage building inside him. "You thought that was somehow better than letting the truth come to light through proper channels." Isabel laughed, a sound that once had charmed European nobility, but now sounded hollow in the ornate room. "Proper channels, Alexander, you sweet naive boy. There are no proper channels when it comes to the kind of secrets your mother discovered. There are only survivors and casualties." The prince moved closer, his presence imposing despite his relatively young age of 34. Years of military training and royal duties had given him a bearing that commanded respect, even from someone as manipulative as his stepmother. "What exactly did my mother discover, Isabel? What was worth betraying the trust of an entire kingdom?" For the first time since he had entered the room, Isabel's composure cracked slightly. Her hand paused as she reached for a jewelry box, and Alexander caught a glimpse of something that might have been fear flickering across her features. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough to escape his notice. "That's not for me to say," she replied, snapping the suitcase closed with more force than necessary. "Perhaps you should ask your father. Or better yet, ask your Uncle Richard. He might have some interesting insights into your family's glorious history." Alexander felt his blood turn to ice at the mention of his uncle, the Duke of Westmere. Richard Aldridge had always been a controversial figure within the royal family, but he was blood, and blood was supposed to mean something in their world. The suggestion that Uncle Richard was somehow connected to whatever his mother had discovered sent his mind racing through possibilities, none of them pleasant. "Don't you dare try to deflect this onto my family," Alexander said through gritted teeth. "You're the one who violated the trust placed in you. You're the one who stole private documents from this palace and put them up for auction like some common thief." Isabel wheeled around, her own temper finally breaking free from the carefully controlled facade she usually maintained. "Common thief? I saved this family from complete destruction. Do you think I wanted to sell those journals? Do you think it gave me pleasure to watch our marriage crumble and our reputation turn to ash?" "Our marriage?" Alexander's voice was incredulous. "You married my father, Isabel. Not the institution, but you never understood the difference, did you? You saw the crown, the palaces, the power, and you thought that was enough. You never understood what it meant to serve something greater than yourself." The queen consort's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, the mask slipped completely. Alexander saw the calculating opportunist who had maneuvered herself into position to marry a grieving king who had spent 3 years systematically trying to erase his mother's influence from the palace and who had ultimately betrayed them all for reasons he was only beginning to understand. "Service?" Isabel spat. "I gave your father 3 years of devoted service. I stood by his side through state dinners and diplomatic crises. I smiled and waved and played the perfect royal wife while he mourned a ghost and you treated me like an intruder in my own home." "Because that's exactly what you were," Alexander replied without hesitation. "An intruder who never understood that being royal isn't about wearing a crown or living in a palace. It's about sacrifice. It's about putting the good of the kingdom above your own desires. It's about honor. Something you clearly know nothing about." Isabel picked up her suitcase and moved toward the door, but Alexander blocked her path. For a long moment they stood facing each other, stepmother and stepson locked in a battle of wills that represented everything that had gone wrong in the 3 years since King Edmund had remarried. "Get out of my way, Alexander," Isabel said quietly, "unless you plan to have me physically removed like some common criminal." "The thought had occurred to me," he admitted, then stepped aside. "But you're not worth the scandal it would create. You've done enough damage to this family's reputation." As Isabel passed him, she paused and spoke without turning around. "When those journals are made public and the whole world learns what your precious mother discovered, remember that I tried to prevent it. I tried to save all of you from the truth. The truth is never the enemy," Alexander replied. "Lies and betrayal are what destroy families, not honesty." Isabel continued walking, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the corridor where King Edmund's personal guard waited to escort her from the palace. Alexander remained in the doorway, watching as the woman who had tried to replace his mother in their lives and their hearts finally left their home for the last time. But as her footsteps faded, Alexander felt no sense of victory. The journals were still out there, scheduled to be auctioned in less than a week. Whatever secrets his mother had uncovered were about to become public knowledge, and Isabel's parting words echoed in his mind like a warning bell. His mother had been many things: beloved queen, devoted wife, caring mother, but she had also been incredibly intelligent and observant. If she had discovered something significant enough to threaten the stability of the kingdom, then perhaps Isabel's betrayal was motivated by more than simple greed. Alexander walked to the window and watched as Isabel's car disappeared through the palace gates. The media would have a field day with her expulsion, but that was the least of their problems. In 6 days, his mother's private thoughts and observations would be laid bare before the world, and whatever she had learned about the Aldridge family would become public knowledge. The prince pulled out his phone and dialed his father's private number. It rang once before King Edmund's tired voice answered. "She's gone," Alexander said without preamble. came the reply, though the king's voice lacked conviction. Have you learned anything more about the journals? Only that Uncle Richard might be connected to whatever Mother discovered. Isabel seemed to think he would have interesting insights into our family history. There was a long pause before the king responded. Come to my study, Alexander. There are things we need to discuss before those journals become public. Things I probably should have told you years ago. Alexander ended the call and took one last look around his mother's former chambers. Whatever secrets were about to be revealed, whatever damage was about to be done to their family's reputation, he would face it head-on. The House of Aldridge had survived wars, revolutions, and scandals before. They would survive this too, even if it meant confronting truths that some members of the family had spent decades trying to hide. As he left the room and closed the door behind him, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his stepmother's expulsion was not an ending, but a beginning. The real battle for his family's legacy was about to begin, and the weapons would be secrets, lies, and the written words of a queen who had taken her discoveries to the grave. The palace might have been rid of Isabel Montclair, but the chaos she had unleashed was just getting started. In less than a week, the world would know whatever Queen Evangeline had deemed important enough to document in her private journals. And if his stepmother's dire warnings were to be believed, it would change everything they thought they knew about the royal family of Eldoria. King Edmund Aldridge sat behind the massive oak desk that had served Eldorian monarchs for over 2 centuries, his weathered hands wrapped around a crystal tumbler of whiskey despite the early morning hour. At 58, he looked every day of his age and then some. The past 3 years had etched deep lines around his gray eyes, and his once thick brown hair had turned predominantly silver. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had aged him in ways that even the loss of his beloved Evangeline had not. Prince Alexander entered the king's private study without knocking, a privilege reserved for immediate family members. The room was exactly as it had been when Alexander was a child sneaking in to watch his father work. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, interrupted by portraits of previous monarchs, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes on everything from constitutional law to military history. The morning light filtering through tall windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, giving the room an almost ethereal quality that seemed appropriate for the conversation they were about to have. "Sit down, son," Edmund said without looking up from the documents scattered across his desk. "We have much to discuss and very little time to do it." Alexander settled into one of the burgundy leather chairs facing the desk, noting that his father looked more haggard than he had seen him since the dark days immediately following his mother's death. The king's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, and his shirt sleeves rolled up as if he had been working through the night. "How long have you known about Mother's journals?" Alexander asked directly. He had learned long ago that dancing around difficult topics with his father was a waste of time. Edmund finally looked up, and Alexander was shocked to see something he had rarely witnessed in his father's eyes: fear. Not the political calculation that usually governed royal decisions, not the careful consideration of public opinion that shaped their every move, but genuine, bone-deep fear of what was coming. "I've known about them since the day she died," Edmund admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She left them to you in her will, along with a letter explaining why she thought you should have them. But I convinced the lawyers to delay the transfer, hoping I could find a way to manage the situation." "Manage the situation?" Alexander's voice rose with indignation. "Those journals were my inheritance from Mother, and you kept them from me? For 3 years?" The king stood and walked to one of the tall windows, his back to his son. Outside, the palace gardens were coming alive with the morning activity of groundskeepers and security personnel, a normal day in a world that was about to become anything but normal. "Your mother discovered something during her final months," Edmund said, his voice heavy with regret. "Something about our family that I had hoped would die with the previous generation. I thought if I could keep the journals sealed, if I could find a way to have them destroyed quietly, then the secret would remain buried." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. His mother had been fighting cancer during her last months, but she had remained sharp and engaged until the very end. If she had used her remaining time to investigate something significant, it meant she had considered it important enough to pursue, even while battling for her life. "What did she discover, father?" Alexander asked, though he was beginning to suspect he might not want to know the answer. Edmund turned back toward his son, and the expression on his face was one of a man who had carried a terrible burden for far too long. He walked to a portrait hanging on the far wall, a formal painting of his younger brother Richard in military dress uniform, and stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. "Do you remember the summer when you were 12? Edmund asked suddenly. "When we all went to the estate in Thorndale and your Uncle Richard was there with his regiment?" Alexander nodded slowly. That summer had been one of his favorites as a child. Uncle Richard had seemed so glamorous in his military uniform, full of stories about far-off places and dangerous adventures. He had taught Alexander to ride properly and had promised to help him with his military training when he was older. "Your mother noticed something that summer," Edmund continued. "Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies in stories Richard told about his military service. Dates that didn't match up, places he claimed to have been that conflicted with official records she happened to see." The king moved to a locked cabinet behind his desk and withdrew a key from his vest pocket. Inside the cabinet were several manila folders and what appeared to be photocopies of official documents. Alexander recognized his mother's neat handwriting on several pages of notes. "She began investigating quietly," Edmund said, placing the folders on the desk between them. "Your mother had always been thorough about everything, and she applied that same attention to detail to researching Richard's military career. What she found, disturbing." Alexander opened the first folder and immediately understood why his father had been so reluctant to share this information. The documents inside were copies of military records, financial statements, and what appeared to be correspondence between his uncle and several foreign governments. "Uncle Richard was selling information to enemy states?" Alexander asked, though the evidence was clear enough. "Worse than that," Edmund replied grimly. "He was actively working against Eldorian interests while wearing our uniform. The money he received wasn't just payment for information. It was funding for operations designed to destabilize our allies and undermine our international relationships." Alexander felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. Richard Aldridge wasn't just a beloved uncle. He was the Duke of Westmere, a senior member of the royal family, and a decorated military officer who had served as an advisor to the crown for over 2 decades. The idea that he had been living a double life as a traitor was almost impossible to process. "How long did this go on?" Alexander asked, dreading the answer. "According to your mother's research, at least 15 years, Edmund said, possibly longer. She traced suspicious financial transactions and communications going back to when Richard first received his commission. She believed he might have been recruited while he was still in military academy." The prince stood and began pacing, his mind racing through the implications. If his uncle had been selling state secrets for 15 years, there was no telling how much damage he had done to Eldorian security interests. Allies could have been compromised, military operations exposed, diplomatic initiatives sabotaged. "Why didn't you act on this information when Mother first brought it to you?" Alexander demanded. Edmund's face crumpled with shame. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "Richard is my brother, blood of my blood. The scandal of exposing a member of the royal family as a traitor would have destroyed the monarchy's credibility. I convinced myself that if I could handle it quietly, if I could force Richard to retire and disappear without a public trial, then perhaps the damage could be minimized. And instead you let him continue?" Alexander was horrified. "No," Edmund said quickly. "I confronted Richard immediately after your mother showed me the evidence. He denied everything at first, then broke down and confessed when faced with the documentation. I gave him 2 choices: resign all his positions and go into permanent exile, or face a public trial for treason." Alexander stopped pacing and stared at his father. "But Uncle Richard is still here. He was at the state dinner last month. He still has his military rank and his position in the succession." The king's face went ashen. He was supposed to be gone by now. "He promised me he would resign quietly and disappear. I gave him 6 months to arrange his affairs and find somewhere to live where he couldn't cause any more damage." A terrible understanding began to dawn on Alexander. "That's why Mother documented everything so thoroughly. She suspected you wouldn't follow through, didn't she?" Edmund nodded miserably. "She made me promise to take action, but she also created an insurance policy. The journals contain not just her research, but also detailed accounts of every conversation we had about Richard, including my promises to deal with the situation. She knew me too well." Alexander sank back into his chair. overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. His mother had spent her final months not just fighting cancer, but also fighting to protect their kingdom from a threat that came from within their own family, and his father had failed to honor her dying wish to see justice done. "There's more," Edmund said quietly, producing another folder from the cabinet. "Your mother discovered that Richard wasn't working alone. He had help from someone with access to the highest levels of government intelligence." The new folder contained photographs, surveillance reports, and financial records that painted an even more disturbing picture. Alexander's uncle hadn't just been a lone wolf selling secrets. He had been part of a sophisticated network that included at least 3 other high-ranking officials and possibly members of parliament. "How many people know about this?" Alexander asked. "Until today, just myself, you, and whoever Isabel told when she decided to sell the journals," Edmund replied. "Your mother was extremely careful to keep her investigation secret. She trusted no one except me, and as we've established, that trust may have been misplaced." Alexander studied the documents spread across the desk, trying to process the full scope of the betrayal. His uncle, a man he had looked up to and admired, had been systematically working against everything their family stood for. His father, a man he had respected above all others, had allowed that betrayal to continue out of misplaced loyalty and fear of scandal. "What happens now?" Alexander asked. "The auction is in 5 days. Once these journals become public, there will be no way to contain the scandal." Edmund walked back to the window and stared out at the gardens where he and his brother had played as children, where they had learned about duty and honor and service to the crown. "Now we prepare for the worst political crisis our family has faced in over a century," he said. "We hope that the British people will understand that the actions of one man do not reflect on the entire institution of the monarchy." "And Uncle Richard?" The king's jaw tightened. "Richard will finally face the consequences of his choices. The authorities will have to be notified, and he will stand trial for treason. There's no way to protect him once these journals become public." Alexander felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness at that prospect. Justice would finally be served, but it would come at a tremendous cost to their family and their kingdom. The royal family would survive as they always had, but they would be forever changed by the revelations to come. "Father?" Alexander said carefully, "There's something else we need to consider." If Isabel knew about the contents of these journals, if she understood what they contained, then her decision to sell them might not have been motivated by greed alone.
Edmund turned from the window, his expression puzzled.
"What do you mean?" "Think about it," Alexander continued. "Isabel is from Valdoria. Her family has significant business interests throughout Eastern Europe, the same region where Uncle Richard was selling secrets. What if she wasn't trying to expose him? What if she was trying to profit from his treachery one last time before it all came crashing down?" The possibility hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. If Alexander was right, then Isabel's betrayal ran even deeper than they had imagined. She hadn't just stolen and sold the journals out of spite or greed. She had been part of the conspiracy all along. "My God," Edmund whispered. "What have I brought into our family?" The question would haunt both men in the days to come as they prepared for a scandal that would shake the very foundations of the Eldorian monarchy. The journals were out there beyond their control, carrying secrets that would destroy lives and topple careers. And somewhere in the palace, Uncle Richard continued to go about his daily routine, unaware that his decades of treachery were about to be exposed to the world. The king and his heir sat in silence, contemplating a future that neither of them could have imagined just hours before. In 5 days, everything would change. The only question now was whether the House of Aldridge would survive the coming storm. The secure briefing room in the basement of Ravencrest Palace had been designed during the Cold War to withstand nuclear attack, but on this gray Tuesday morning, it felt more like a bunker preparing for the end of the world. Director Margaret Sheffield of the Eldorian Intelligence Service sat across from Prince Alexander, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation they were discussing. Between them lay copies of Queen Evangeline's journals, along with additional files that had been declassified in the past 48 hours. "Your Highness," Director Sheffield began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had spent 3 decades in intelligence work, "what we're dealing with here is far more extensive than anyone initially realized. Your mother's investigation, thorough as it was only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. Alexander studied the woman who had served his family loyally for over a decade. Margaret Sheffield was known for her uncompromising dedication to the crown and her ability to see threats that others missed. If she was concerned, then the situation was even worse than he had feared. How much worse? Alexander asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Sheffield opened a classified file marked with the highest security clearance. Inside were surveillance photographs, intercepted communications, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic betrayal stretching back nearly 2 decades. The images showed his uncle Richard meeting with known foreign operatives in locations ranging from Swiss banks to Mediterranean resorts. "We believe the Duke of Westmere was recruited while he was still in military academy," Sheffield continued. "Our analysis suggests he was approached by Valdorian intelligence services initially, but over time, his handler shifted to representing a consortium of interests that included at least 4 different nations, all of whom had reasons to want to destabilize Eldorian foreign policy." Alexander felt his stomach turn as he recognized several faces in the surveillance photographs. These weren't shadowy foreign spies meeting in dark alleys. These were people he had seen at state dinners, diplomatic receptions, and family gatherings. The network of betrayal had been operating in plain sight, hidden behind the respectability of diplomatic immunity and social connections. "The financial records are equally disturbing," Sheffield continued, producing a thick folder of bank statements and wire transfers. Over the past 15 years, the Duke received payments totaling nearly £12 million, all laundered through a complex network of shell companies and foreign banks. The money came from multiple sources, suggesting he was providing information to several different buyers. "What kind of information?" Alexander asked, dreading the specifics. Sheffield's expression grew even more grim. "Everything, Your Highness. Military deployment schedules, diplomatic negotiation strategies, intelligence assessments of foreign threats, advance warning of policy changes that could affect international markets." He had access to cabinet-level briefings through his advisory role to the Crown, and he appears to have been sharing virtually everything he learned. The prince studied a financial summary that showed the scope of his uncle's betrayal in cold, hard numbers. £12 million over 15 years worked out to an average of £800,000 per year. Richard hadn't been selling secrets occasionally for extra money. He had been operating a systematic espionage business that generated substantial annual income. "How did he avoid detection for so long?" Alexander asked. "Quite cleverly, actually," Sheffield admitted with grudging professional respect. "The Duke never took meetings on Eldorian soil. He used his legitimate travel for royal duties and military exercises as cover for clandestine meetings. His handlers were sophisticated enough to use diplomatic pouches and embassy communications to avoid electronic surveillance. And perhaps most importantly, he never got greedy." Alexander looked up from the financial records. "What do you mean?" "Most traitors are eventually caught because they become careless or greedy," Sheffield explained. "They start taking unnecessary risks or demanding larger payments. The Duke was patient and methodical. He took a steady income rather than large lump sums, he maintained excellent operational security, and he never tried to recruit others or expand his network beyond what was absolutely necessary. But he did have help," Alexander pointed out, remembering the additional names his mother had identified. Sheffield nodded grimly. 3 other individuals, all of whom had access to sensitive information through their government positions. We've been monitoring them for the past 48 hours, and I'm afraid the situation has become quite urgent." She produced another set of surveillance photographs showing a middle-aged man in expensive suit entering what appeared to be a private bank in Geneva. Alexander recognized him immediately. Lord Chancellor Hampton, one of his father's most trusted advisors, and a man who had served the crown for over 20 years. "Hampton was photographed yesterday making what appears to be a large cash withdrawal," Sheffield continued. "Our sources at the bank indicate he closed several accounts and transferred significant funds to banks in non-extradition countries. We believe he's preparing to flee." Alexander felt as though the ground was shifting beneath him. Lord Chancellor Hampton had been a fixture in palace life for as long as he could remember. The man had taught him constitutional law, had advised him on matters of statecraft, and had been present at every major royal ceremony for the past 2 decades. "What about the others?" Alexander asked. Sheffield produced photographs of 2 more familiar faces. Deputy Minister Catherine Wells from the Foreign Office and General Marcus Thornfield from the Defense Ministry. Both were shown in what appeared to be clandestine meetings with unidentified individuals in locations far from London. General Thornfield appears to be maintaining his normal routine, Sheffield reported. But our surveillance indicates he's been making unusual communications with foreign contacts. Deputy Minister Wells has requested emergency leave and hasn't been seen since yesterday morning. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. These weren't low-level clerks selling photocopied documents. These were senior government officials with access to the most sensitive state secrets. The damage they could have done over 15 years of coordinated espionage was almost incalculable. Director Sheffield, Alexander said carefully, "There's something else we need to discuss. My stepmother, Isabel Montclair, may have been involved in this network." Sheffield's expression didn't change, but Alexander caught the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated she was processing new information. "What makes you think so, Your Highness?" Alexander explained his theory about Isabel's Valdorian connections and her possible motivation for selling the journals. As he spoke, he watched Sheffield's face grow increasingly troubled. "That would explain several things we couldn't account for," Sheffield said slowly. "The timing of when the journals were stolen, the specific auction house that was chosen, and the fact that certain intelligence services seem to have advanced knowledge of what the journals contain." She opened yet another file, this one containing communications intercepts and financial records related to Isabel's family business interests. The pattern that emerged was damning. The Montclair family companies had received several large contracts from Eastern European governments over the past 3 years, all of them in countries where Uncle Richard had been active. Your stepmother's family business received over £8 million in contracts from Valdorian government entities during her marriage to King Edmund, Sheffield reported. The contracts were for infrastructure development and consulting services, but our analysis suggests the actual work performed was minimal. The payments appear to have been compensation for services rendered to Valdorian intelligence operations. Alexander felt a cold fury building in his chest. Isabel hadn't just married his father for love or even for social status. She had been a foreign intelligence asset from the beginning. Her entire relationship with the royal family had been part of an elaborate espionage operation designed to gain access to the highest levels of government. "How long have you suspected this?" Alexander asked. "We've had concerns about the Montclair family's business relationships for some time," Sheffield admitted. "But without evidence of direct intelligence sharing, we couldn't act on our suspicions. Your mother's journals provide the missing pieces we needed to understand the full scope of the operation." The implications were staggering. For 3 years, a foreign intelligence operative had been living in Ravencrest Palace, attending state dinners, participating in private family discussions, and potentially reporting everything back to her handlers. The security breach was so massive that Alexander wondered how the monarchy could possibly recover from the scandal. "What's our exposure?" Alexander asked, using the clinical language of intelligence assessment to distance himself from the personal betrayal he was feeling. Sheffield consulted a thick analysis report prepared by her staff. "Substantial, Your Highness. Based on the access your stepmother had and the duration of her residence in the palace, we have to assume that virtually all family conversations, policy discussions, and strategic planning from the past 3 years has been compromised. Foreign intelligence services may have advanced knowledge of government policies, military plans, and diplomatic initiatives for months or even years into the future." The prince stood and walked to the secure phone mounted on the wall of the briefing room. His father needed to know about these developments immediately, and decisions needed to be made about how to handle the expanding crisis. "Director Sheffield," Alexander said as he reached for the phone, "I want you to prepare arrest warrants for Uncle Richard, Lord Chancellor Hampton, Deputy Minister Wells, and General Thornfield. This conspiracy ends today regardless of the political consequences." Sheffield nodded approvingly. "Yes, Your Highness. What about your stepmother?" Alexander paused with his hand on the phone. Isabel was already out of the country, probably beyond the reach of Eldorian law enforcement. But her family's business interests were still vulnerable, and there were ways to apply pressure even to someone who had fled to a non-extradition country. "Coordinate with the Treasury to freeze all Montclair family assets in Eldorian banks," Alexander ordered. "And prepare a formal request for extradition through Interpol. If Isabel wants to play intelligence games, she'll learn that the House of Aldridge doesn't forgive treachery easily. As he dialed his father's private number, Alexander reflected on how much had changed in just 3 days. His stepmother's expulsion from the palace had seemed like the end of a personal crisis, but it was actually the beginning of the largest security scandal in modern Eldorian history. The journals that were scheduled to be auctioned in 2 days would expose not just his uncle's individual betrayal, but an entire network of treason that had operated at the highest levels of government for nearly 2 decades. The phone rang once before King Edmund answered, his voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. "Alexander?" "Father, we need to talk immediately," Alexander said. "The situation is much worse than we thought. I'm bringing Director Sheffield up to brief you on what we've discovered." There was a long pause before the king responded. "How much worse, son?" Alexander looked around the secure briefing room, with its walls covered in evidence of systematic betrayal by people they had trusted with their lives and their kingdom. "Worse than we could have imagined, Father. We're not just dealing with one traitor. We're dealing with an entire network that has been operating under our noses for 15 years. When Alexander hung up the phone, he realized that in 2 days, when his mother's journals were made public, the world would learn not just about Uncle Richard's individual crimes, but about a conspiracy that had compromised Eldorian national security at the highest levels. The monarchy would survive as it always had, but the cost would be measured not just in political scandal, but in the fundamental trust between the crown and the people it served. The network that had operated in shadows for so long was finally being dragged into the light, and the consequences would reshape the Eldorian government for years to come. The pre-dawn raid on the Duke of Westmere's estate unfolded with military precision, though Prince Alexander took no satisfaction in watching his uncle being led away in handcuffs. From his position in the unmarked surveillance van parked half a mile from Thornfield Manor, Alexander observed through high-definition monitors as Eldorian Intelligence Service agents systematically searched the property that had been in their family for over 3 centuries. Director Sheffield sat beside him, coordinating the simultaneous operations taking place across the kingdom through an encrypted radio system. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, teams had moved on all 4 primary targets, hoping to catch them before they realized their network had been exposed. "Target 2 is in custody," came the report from the team assigned to Lord Chancellor Hampton. He was attempting to board a private aircraft at Westbridge Airport. Significant amounts of cash and classified documents were recovered from his luggage. Alexander felt a grim satisfaction at Hampton's capture. The man who had served as one of his father's most trusted advisors had been planning to flee the country with state secrets and blood money, abandoning the government he had sworn to serve with no regard for the damage his betrayal would cause. "Target 3 is secured," reported another team leader. Deputy Minister Wells was found at a safe house in Dover, apparently waiting for transport across the channel. She attempted to destroy documents when agents entered the premises, but most materials were recovered intact. Sheffield made notes on a tactical display showing the locations of all 4 operations. General Thornfield remained at large, but intelligence indicated he was still in the country, possibly unaware that his network had been compromised. "Target 4's residence is empty," came the disappointing report from the Defense Ministry operation. "Neighbors report no activity for the past 2 days. We're checking military facilities and known associates." Alexander watched as his uncle was placed in the back of an armored transport vehicle. The man who had taught him to ride and shoot now reduced to a traitor in chains. Even through the grainy surveillance footage, Alexander could see that Richard looked older than his 54 years, as if the weight of his crimes had finally caught up with him. "Your Highness," Sheffield said quietly, "we're receiving reports that several foreign embassy personnel are leaving the country on emergency flights this morning. It appears word of the arrests has reached their intelligence services. That was expected, but still troubling. The exposure of the spy network would cause a cascade of diplomatic problems as foreign governments tried to extract their own assets before they could be arrested or compromised." Alexander wondered how many other intelligence operations were being burned as collateral damage from his family scandal. "Have we located the auction house representatives?" Alexander asked. Sheffield consulted another report. "Sotheby's has agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. The journals are being held in their secure vault pending legal proceedings. They provided us with a list of parties who showed interest in bidding, which includes several individuals with known intelligence connections." Alexander felt a moment of relief that his mother's private thoughts wouldn't be displayed for public entertainment, but the damage was far from contained. Word of the journal's contents was already spreading through intelligence circles and diplomatic channels. Even if the actual documents remained sealed, their revelations would reshape international relationships for years to come. The radio crackled with another update. Target 1 is requesting to speak with Prince Alexander. He claims he has information about additional conspirators that weren't mentioned in the journals. Alexander looked to Sheffield, who nodded grimly. He may be telling the truth, Your Highness. Networks like this often have peripheral members who aren't directly documented, but who provided support or information on an ad hoc basis. Set up the interview, Alexander decided. But I want full recording and analysis of everything he says. Uncle Richard is a skilled manipulator, and I won't give him the opportunity to lie his way out of the consequences of his actions. 2 hours later, Alexander sat across from his uncle in an interview room at the secure facility where high-value prisoners were held. Richard looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and restraints that had replaced his usual expensive tailored suits, but his eyes remained alert and calculating, suggesting he was already working on damage control strategies. Alexander, Richard began, his voice carrying the same warm tone he had always used with his nephew. I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to hurt you or your father. Everything I did was motivated by a desire to protect our family and our country. Alexander remained silent, allowing his uncle to speak while analysts in another room recorded and evaluated every word for signs of deception or manipulation. He had learned from Director Sheffield that the best interrogation technique was often simply giving the subject enough rope to hang themselves. The people I was working with, Richard continued, they weren't enemies of Eldoria. They were allies who needed better information to coordinate our mutual interests. The intelligence sharing was sanctioned at levels above my clearance. That's a lie, Alexander said calmly. We have 15 years of financial records showing you received payments for classified information. We have surveillance footage of you meeting with known foreign operatives. We have communications intercepts proving you shared sensitive military and diplomatic intelligence with hostile governments. Richard's composure cracked slightly, revealing the desperation beneath his carefully constructed facade. You don't understand the bigger picture, Alexander. There are threats to this kingdom that go far beyond what the official intelligence services recognize. I was part of an informal network designed to address those threats. By selling state secrets to Valdorian intelligence, by compromising military operations and diplomatic initiatives, by betraying the trust of every person who served alongside you? Alexander's voice remained level, but his anger was evident. Valdoria isn't our enemy, Richard insisted. They're a small country trying to navigate between larger powers. The information I shared helped them maintain their independence, which serves our strategic interests in the region. Alexander leaned forward, his blue eyes boring into his uncle's. What about the other buyers, Uncle Richard? Our records show you received payments from at least 4 different intelligence services. Were they all just innocent allies trying to maintain their independence? For the first time, Richard hesitated, and Alexander knew they were approaching the truth. His uncle hadn't been motivated by misguided patriotism or strategic thinking. He had been motivated by greed and the thrill of operating outside the law. There's something else you need to know, Richard said suddenly, apparently deciding to change tactics. Isabel didn't steal those journals on her own. She was following orders from her handlers, and they have additional intelligence assets placed throughout the government. Alexander felt his blood run cold. If Richard was telling the truth, then the network they had exposed was even larger than Director Sheffield had estimated. There could be dozens of foreign assets operating within the Eldorian government, all coordinating their activities through intelligence services that had been planning this operation for years. Who? Alexander demanded. Richard smiled, the expression transforming his face into something predatory and unrecognizable. That information is worth something, nephew. Perhaps we can discuss what my cooperation might be worth in terms of sentencing recommendations. Alexander stood abruptly, disgusted by his uncle's attempt to bargain for leniency, even as he revealed additional threats to national security. You're in no position to make deals, Uncle Richard. You'll provide that information because it's your duty to the crown you've already betrayed, or you'll face the full consequences of treason without any consideration for cooperation. You're making a mistake, Alexander. Richard called as the prince moved toward the door. "The people behind this operation aren't going to simply disappear because you've arrested a few middle-level assets. They've been planning this for decades, and your mother's investigation only revealed the parts they were willing to let her find." Alexander paused with his hand on the door handle. "What do you mean?" Richard's smile widened. "Do you really think your brilliant mother discovered a 15-year espionage operation by accident? Do you think it was coincidence that she started investigating just as she was dying of cancer? They wanted her to find those secrets, Alexander. The journals were never meant to remain private. They were designed to create exactly the crisis we're experiencing now." The implications of what Richard was suggesting hit Alexander like a physical blow. If his uncle was telling the truth, then his mother hadn't uncovered a conspiracy. She had been manipulated into documenting one that was meant to be exposed. The entire scandal, from Isabel's betrayal to the auction of the journals, had been orchestrated to achieve some larger strategic objective. "Why?" Alexander asked, returning to his seat despite his earlier intention to leave. "Because sometimes you need to burn down the old structure to build something new," Richard replied cryptically. "The intelligence services that recruited me 20 years ago have been working toward a very specific goal, and the exposure of our network is actually a crucial step in achieving it." Alexander felt as though he was drowning in layers of deception and manipulation. Every answer led to new questions. Every revelation suggested additional conspiracies operating behind the scenes. His family's personal tragedy was apparently just one move in a complex geopolitical chess game that had been playing out for decades. "Director Sheffield needs to hear this," Alexander said, pressing a button to summon the intelligence chief. "By all means," Richard agreed, "but understand that everything I'm telling you now was part of the plan. My arrest, my cooperation, even this conversation. It's all been anticipated and accounted for. The real question is whether you're prepared to learn just how deep this conspiracy goes, and whether you're ready to make the kinds of decisions that will be required to protect the crown from what's coming next." As Director Sheffield entered the interview room, Alexander realized that his mother's journals had been just the opening move in a campaign that was far from over. The network they had exposed was apparently designed to be discovered, which meant the real conspiracy remained hidden, waiting to reveal itself when the time was right. The reckoning had only just begun. 3 months after the arrests that had shaken the foundations of the Eldorian monarchy, Prince Alexander stood on the balcony of Ravencrest Palace, watching thousands of citizens gather in the square below. The crowd was unlike any he had seen before. Not the carefully orchestrated audiences of royal ceremonies, but ordinary people who had come to show their support for a crown that had been tested by scandal and emerged stronger than ever. The revelations from Uncle Richard's extended interrogation had indeed unveiled a conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything they had initially imagined. Foreign intelligence services had spent decades placing assets throughout the Eldorian government, creating a network designed not just to steal secrets, but to gradually undermine the stability of the constitutional monarchy. The ultimate goal had been to create a crisis severe enough to justify a transition to a different form of government, one more easily influenced by outside powers. But the conspirators had miscalculated the resilience of both the institution they sought to destroy and the people who supported it. Rather than abandoning the monarchy in the face of scandal, the Eldorian people had rallied around King Edmund and Prince Alexander, recognizing that they too had been victims of the elaborate deception. Director Sheffield approached Alexander on the balcony, carrying a thick folder that contained the final intelligence assessment of the crisis they had weathered. At 53, she looked older than her years, the stress of the past months having added new lines to her face and streaks of white to her steel-gray hair. "The last of the foreign assets has been identified and either arrested or deported," she reported. "Our counterintelligence teams have swept every level of government, and we're confident that the network has been completely dismantled." Alexander accepted the folder but didn't immediately open it. He had read enough intelligence reports in recent months to last a lifetime, each one revealing new layers of betrayal and manipulation. The final tally had been staggering. 37 government officials compromised, 12 foreign intelligence services involved, and over £50 million in bribes and payments distributed over 2 decades. "What about General Thornfield?" Alexander asked. "Still at large, but our assets in several non-extradition countries are monitoring his activities," Sheffield replied. "He's effectively neutralized as a threat, but bringing him back for trial remains a priority." Alexander nodded. then opened the folder to review the summary conclusions. The intelligence services had worked tirelessly to understand not just what had happened, but how such an extensive conspiracy had remained undetected for so long. The answer lay in the sophistication of the operation and the patient, methodical approach taken by the foreign handlers.
They were playing a very long game, Sheffield continued, following his thoughts. The initial recruitment of your uncle and the others wasn't about immediate intelligence gathering. It was about positioning assets for a crisis that they planned to create decades in the future. Alexander turned from the balcony to face the intelligence director.
In the months since the arrests, he had come to rely heavily on Sheffield's expertise and judgment. She had proven herself not just as a skilled professional, but as someone genuinely committed to protecting the crown and the Constitution.
And my stepmother's role?
Alexander asked, though he suspected he knew the answer.
Isabel was what our colleagues in the business call a honey trap operation, Sheffield replied bluntly. She was recruited specifically to marry into the royal family and gain access to the highest levels of government. The romance with your father was manufactured from the beginning.
The prince had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still stung. His father had genuinely loved Isabel, had seen her as a chance for happiness after the devastating loss of Queen Evangeline.
Learning that every moment of that relationship had been a carefully orchestrated deception had been almost as difficult for King Edmund as losing his first wife to cancer. How is the king handling the aftermath? Sheffield asked with genuine concern.
Alexander looked back toward the crowd in the square where his father would soon appear to address the nation. King Edmund had aged visibly in the past months, but he had also shown a strength and resilience that had impressed even his harshest critics. Rather than retreating from public life in shame, he had thrown himself into the work of rebuilding the government and restoring public trust.
He's stronger than I expected, Alexander admitted.
The betrayal hurt him deeply, but I think he's found purpose in ensuring that nothing like this can happen again. The constitutional reforms he's proposed will fundamentally change how our government operates. Indeed, King Edmund's response to the crisis had been to propose sweeping changes to the way intelligence services operated, how government officials were vetted and monitored, and how the royal family itself engaged with both domestic and international affairs. The reforms had broad public support and were expected to pass Parliament easily.
There's something else you should know, Sheffield said, producing a smaller folder from her briefcase. We've received intelligence suggesting that your mother may have been aware of more than we initially realized. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. His mother's posthumous revelations had already turned his world upside down. He wasn't sure he was prepared for additional secrets to emerge from her final months.
What kind of intelligence? He asked carefully.
Sheffield opened the folder to reveal what appeared to be coded communications intercepted from foreign intelligence services. The messages were heavily encrypted, but analysts had been able to decode enough to understand their general content. These communications suggest that Queen Evangeline was in contact with our counterintelligence services during her final months, Sheffield explained. Not through official channels, but through backdoor communications that she arranged personally. Alexander stared at the decoded messages, trying to process what he was reading. The implications were staggering. His mother hadn't just stumbled upon the conspiracy by accident, and she hadn't been manipulated into investigating it by foreign handlers. She had been working with Eldorian intelligence all along, using her privileged access and her reputation for discretion to gather evidence that official investigators couldn't obtain.
Mother was a spy?
Alexander asked incredulously.
Not exactly, Sheffield replied.
She was what we call an unwitting asset. Someone who provides intelligence without being formally recruited or trained. But the communications suggest that she understood she was being manipulated by foreign services, and she decided to turn the tables on them. The coded messages painted a picture of Queen Evangeline as far more cunning and strategic than anyone had imagined. Rather than simply documenting the conspiracy she had discovered, she had been feeding selected information back to her foreign contacts while simultaneously sharing everything with Eldorian counterintelligence. The journals were bait, Alexander realized suddenly. Mother knew they would be stolen and sold. She wanted them to be exposed because she knew it would force the entire network into the open. Sheffield nodded approvingly. Your mother was playing a very dangerous game, but she understood that half measures wouldn't be sufficient to root out a conspiracy this extensive. She needed to create a crisis that would justify the kind of comprehensive response we've implemented. Alexander felt a mixture of pride and sadness as he contemplated his mother's final months. Then it doesn't get. While fighting cancer and facing her own mortality, she had also been conducting a sophisticated counterintelligence operation designed to protect the kingdom she loved. The journals that had seemed like such a personal betrayal were actually her final gift to the crown. "Does my father know about this?" Alexander asked. "Not yet," Sheffield replied. "We wanted to confirm our analysis before briefing the king. But yes, he'll need to know that his first wife was essentially conducting espionage operations from her deathbed." Alexander closed the folder and looked back out at the crowd below. In a few minutes, his father would address the nation on the lessons learned from the crisis and the reforms being implemented to prevent future infiltration. The king would speak of resilience, renewal, and the strength that came from confronting difficult truths. But Alexander now understood that the real hero of this story had been his mother, who had used her final months not just to expose a conspiracy, but to orchestrate its complete destruction. Queen Evangeline had played a game more complex and dangerous than any of the foreign spies who had tried to manipulate her. And she had won decisively. "There's one more thing," Sheffield said, producing a sealed envelope from her briefcase. "This was found in a safe deposit box that your mother arranged to be opened only after the crisis had been resolved. It's addressed to you personally." Alexander took the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing his mother's elegant handwriting on the outside. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message that brought tears to his eyes. "My dearest Alexander, if you are reading this, then the kingdom has survived the storm I helped to create. The crown will be stronger for having been tested, and you will be a better king for having faced these challenges. The House of Aldridge endures not because we are perfect, but because we are willing to confront our imperfections and emerge renewed. Trust in the people, trust in the institution, and trust in yourself. All my love, Mother." As Alexander finished reading, he heard the crowd below begin to cheer. King Edmund had appeared on the balcony of the main palace, ready to address his people and begin the next chapter in their nation's history. The crisis was over. The conspirators had been defeated, and the monarchy had emerged from its darkest hour stronger and more legitimate than ever. Alexander folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, next to his heart. The phoenix crown of Eldoria had indeed risen from the ashes of scandal and betrayal, just as his mother had planned. The kingdom would endure, the people would prosper, and the House of Aldridge would continue its sacred duty to serve both crown and country. The game was over, and they had won.